It's 94.1 Hard Knock Radio. Davey D hanging out with you this afternoon. And we have two special guests, one in the studio, one on the phone lines. The author of a very controversial book, LAbyrinth. It deals with the Los Angeles Police Department, Suge Knight, gangs in L.A., the Rampart scandal. I mean, this is a book that covers it all, and we have the authors here. And first of all, welcome to Hard Knock Radio. Randall, we had you on a month ago.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
And you're a writer for Rollingstone on a regular.
Yeah,
right?
I've been contributing editor at Rollingstone for 20 years.
20? Oh, well, that's quite a time. That's older than some of our listeners.
Yeah,
you know?
I bet it is.
And on our phone lines, we have, I'm not sure if you're in Los Angeles, but former detective for the LAPD, Russell Poole. You're the main person that was the centerpiece in this book. How are you doing?
Pretty good, Davey. Thanks for having me on.
You know, I read the book. It raised a lot of questions. You cover a lot of ground. You leave a lot of questions to be answered. It's also been criticisms as well as praise. What is the book about? You know, what was the whole intention of the book? I'll start off with you, Randall.
I would say the intention of the book was to demonstrate that a lot of investigations that should have been done were not done, that the media...
Done about what?
Done well, specifically about the murders of Biggie and Tupac, but also the involvement of LAPD officers and police officers from other departments with death row records in connection to at least Biggie's murder, if not Tupac's. About how the Rampart scandal was in a lot of ways an overlay on a much more disturbing scandal. It had to do with these police officers working for death row records. And it's about, ultimately, I think the book's about how racial politics actually worked against black people, even though it was black people who were pushing the agenda, black leaders. I think the victims didn't have much of a voice, and they happen to be black too. So
where you pick up on this story after the March 9th, I guess it was 97, death of Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls.
Correct.
Took place after at the Soul Train party, after party.
Right.
I can't remember the name of the place. It was like a museum.
The Peterson Auto Museum.
Right. And that left a lot of questions. I mean, almost from the start. I mean, we're talking about a guy who was the rival to Tupac Shakur, who died 6 months to a day earlier. There was a lot of speculation that people connected to Tupac had something to do with it, and raised even more questions for me personally because I knew Biggie and I knew Pac. I did interview with Biggie 4 days before his death, and he seemed to definitely be in a different headspace. You're talking about a guy who on record said a lot of things that we would equate to gangster rap, but when I was talking to him, he seemed like he was ready to make a change and move into a different direction. The real controversy that came up for me was there were a lot of people that I know that were down there when this happened. And so maybe I can ask you, Detective Poole, were you immediately assigned to investigating the Notorious B.I.G. case?
No, I wasn't. Wilshire detectives were initially assigned the case, and I received the case 30 days after the killing.
Were you aware of what took place during the first 30 days, immediately afterwards?
Well, yes. When the case was reassigned to Robbery Homicide Division, we obtained all the materials and clues that had been obtained up until then and studied all the material.
Was there an initial conclusion? Well, I guess it wasn't a conclusion, but an initial understanding of what may have happened?
Well, right from the get-go, the detectives believed somehow Death Row Records was involved, and of course, there was speculation that possibly Compton Crips were involved in the killing.
Okay. Were they able to get any of the people that were there? When I remember people from up here went down to that event, and many of them came back to the Bay Area saying that they were near, around, or heard, or seen things that took place. But none of that stuff ever seemed to come up again after that first couple of weeks. And I wanted to know, from a police standpoint, did you find that there were a lot of witnesses to this, or just people who said things and then didn't want to talk on record?
Well, anytime you get a high-profile case, you're going to get a series of clues that come in. And, for example, I worked on the Ennis Cosby case, and there were over 1,500 clues that came in on that. And, of course, one of the clues turned out to be the right clue out of 1,500.
Mm-hmm.
And so same thing on O.J. Simpson. Prior to that, you had thousands of clues coming in, and you have to study each one, and you have to follow up on each clue. And, of course, in this case, the real break in the case was the arrest of David Mack for a bank robbery out in Los Angeles.
Now, for people who aren't familiar, who is David Mack? Maybe you could explain this, Randall.
David Mack was an LAPD officer who had once been a world-class track athlete. In fact, he was number one rated 800-meter runner in the world, and right before the '84 Olympics, hurt his leg, was persuaded to join the LAPD, and had a pretty impressive police career, it seemed, until he was arrested for one of the biggest bank robberies in LA history, which he was caught on film committing. And after that, it came out very quickly that he was a member of the Bloods gang,
Mm-hmm.
was a member of the Nation of Islam, which, being member of the Nation of
David
Islam.
Mack was a member of the Nation of Islam?
Yes.
Okay.
And he proclaimed both those things immediately after his arrest to other inmates and to the cops as well.
Okay.
And had this connection to Death Row Records,
Right.
Which really was something he grew up with, because he and Suge Knight grew up in the same neighborhood. So when he was arrested for the bank robbery, Russell, and he can tell you this, probably in better detail than I can, got a lot of clues that linked David Mack to Biggie's murder, and linked a civilian associate of David Mack's as well.
So it seems like it would be an open and shut case, kind of, so to speak, but obviously this didn't take place. Why was that, Detective Poole?
Well, during the course of the bank robbery investigation, I had interviewed the lead detective in charge of the bank robbery investigation, and he gave me a series of pieces of information that linked David Mack possibly to the killing of Biggie Smalls. One being the fact that when they did a search warrant on his house for the bank robbery, he owned a black SS Impala, and that's the same vehicle that was used in the killing of Biggie Smalls. Second of all, in his garage, which was unusual for a police officer, he had a shrine of Tupac Shakur all over his garage, and that appeared to me unusual. Thirdly,
when you say a shrine, what do you mean?
He had posters, memorabilia, and it was well decorated inside in his garage, and gang members dressed in red, flashing the West Side sign. And
Mack was dressed in a red suits occasionally, and there were photographs of him doing the West Coast sign.
Well, the West Coast sign doesn't mean you're in a gang. I mean,
doesn't
everybody
doesn't necessarily. No, you're right. It means you're claiming a gang affiliation. You may not be actually a member, but
when you throw up the W,
well,
I mean that's shown in videos, and that little kids do that.
Agreed. There's a lot of people playing.
And it was
that.
actually
but
popularized by Tupac back in the days when there was the supposed beef between the West and East Coast rappers. But I mean, as far as I know,
Tupac was embracing a West Coast versus East Coast gang thing. I mean, it had a gang connection. I'm not saying it's entirely, but I mean, the West Coast sign actually did originate in gangs, and it spread into pop.
So it was a West Coast gang. Is that what?
No, the West Coast sign was what the Bloods and the Crips both would use against people that they who were not from the West Coast.
Okay, so. You had all this stuff with this police officer, David Mack, but obviously things didn't just end there. I mean, the guy's in jail now, right? But has he been charged with the murder of the Notorious B.I.G.?
No, the investigation was stymied by the chief of police, Bernard Parks, and there's a number of clues that connect David Mack possibly to the killing. and I requested search warrants to be done on David Mack's home, his financials, etc., and I was denied in doing so. And as time goes on, you try to figure out, well, why doesn't the chief want to probe any further into David Mack's life? And then you find out later, I found out information came in that Chief Parks had recruited David Mack on the job. David Mack he attended Oregon University and then later on attempted to make a comeback in track at USC, and that's where Chief Parks graduated. And Chief Parks was known for recruiting athletes onto the police department. And it turns out that where David Mack did his probation, officers had contacted me and said, hey, it was common knowledge that Chief Parks had recruited David Mack on the job. And so that...
You say probation, his job probation, you mean?
Right. He attended the academy for 6 months. He left the academy, and now he goes to a specific division in LAPD, which was Southeast Division in South Central Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time he got out of the academy, I was working South Bureau Homicide, which I investigated murders in Southeast, Southwest, 77th, and Harbor Divisions.
Okay. That's the voice of former LAPD detective Russell Poole. And we have in the studio with us Randall Sullivan, the authors of the book LAbyrinth, which talks about police corruption in L.A., the death of the Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur, and connections or possible connections with Death Row Records, Suge Knight, and the Rampart scandal that we're all familiar with. Let me ask you this. In the book, you start off. It starts off talking about the shooting death of a police officer, Kevin Gaines. And that's how we kind of enter into this whole narrative, so to speak. Who was Kevin Gaines, and how did things really kick off and really start to unwind these findings that you have?
You talking to me?
Well, I'll start off with Russell, and then we'll go to you,
All right,
Randy.
fine.
Okay, I was assigned the lead investigator to the Gaines Liga shooting.
Now, Gaines is the guy, Kevin Gaines, and who's Liga?
Frank Liga was a narcotics detective,
Mm-hmm.
and he was on duty. And during the course of a traffic incident, Detective Liga shot and killed Kevin Gaines, who had pointed a gun at him on the roadway. And it turned out that Kevin Gaines was living with Sharitha Knight, Suge Knight's estranged wife. And Kevin Gaines was assigned to Pacific Division at the time of his death. And 8 months prior to that, Kevin Gaines was involved in a serious incident in which he called in a 911 call at Sharitha Knight's mansion. And he responded to the scene as LAPD was investigating this 911 call. He then engaged LAPD in a confrontation and actually assaulted one of the officers. He was then handcuffed and taken to the station. Well, when they purged the 911 tape, his voice was identified as making the phone call. And
he made a call on himself?
He identified himself as the victim
yeah.
of a shooting that didn't take place.
And then a couple of months later, he filed a false claim against the city, claiming that the officers had violated his civil rights. And so, right there, that was a felony crime, and LAPD Internal Affairs sat on that information for 8 months without completing an investigation. And he should have been arrested immediately, and charges should have been filed on him. I mean, it was like a smoking gun case. And it turns out in between the time of that incident and the time he was killed, he was involved in about 4 other felony crimes. So Chief Parks was in charge of Internal Affairs at that time, and this case had gone across his desk, and there was absolutely no investigation done. And then Gaines happened to get killed during this one incident. So
let me ask you, not to be cynical or anything, but was that unusual for that to happen, considering the reputation of LAPD? And I mean, we've done dozens of shows, and over my years as being a radio host, I mean, there's all these incidents about LAPD brutalizing folks, covering up things, settling out of court, et cetera, et cetera. Was that unusual types of steps to be taken, for internal affairs or higher-ups to protect officers? I mean, it seemed like it happened under Chief Gates, maybe under Willie Wilson. Was it Willie? Yeah,
Willie was chief when,
Willie,
when that
right.
happened, when this went down.
And, now Bernard Parks. I mean, what makes this situation so unique, considering the reputation of the Los Angeles Police Department?
Well, Kevin Gaines was a member of an organization that was founded by Chief Parks, Oscar Joel Bryant Foundation. Oscar Joel Bryant was a police officer in the 70s who was killed in the line of duty. And Chief Parks formed this organization. It was a black police officer organization. And during the course of our investigation of this incident, Gaines and Liga, members of the Oscar Joel Bryant Association were dispatched the following day to go out and find witnesses in our case. And they actually found witnesses that we had already interviewed, and actually 5 officers entered the business of one of the key witnesses in the case and tried to get her to change her original statement. And she actually called the police saying, hey, some police officers came in here trying to get me to change my story and this and that, and they intimidated me. So, I took her statement, and I immediately reported this up the chain of command. And virtually nothing was really done about it. The woman ended up quitting her job and moving out of state following that incident, and there really was no effort after that to identify the other 4 officers.
Right. Well, again, the question. Go ahead.
These are facts, and I take each case individually, and the fact remains that Chief Parks was in charge of the original Gaines investigation, and nothing was done about it. And to this day, I believe if Gaines would have, been handled the professional way, by arresting him and charging him with a crime, he'd probably still be alive today. And that incident would have never occurred. The gun that he used to point at Frank Liga was his service pistol.
Right.
So,
well, the initial question, and I appreciate you giving us the background on that, was that unusual for officers to be protected and questionable and outlandish incidents to be covered up at times? Well, it seems like that has often been the reputation.
I think it was different in this case. I think what you're talking about historically was cover-ups of police brutality.
Yes,
typically, but not of actual serious criminal activity that is separate from brutality under the color of authority. I mean, these guys were committing. They were committing street crimes. They were committing the kind of crimes you expect, gang members to commit, not police.
But in this case,
the way that investigation was handled, that he told you the story of that group of police officers. They were led by one officer, a man named Derwin Henderson. There's an order comes down from Internal Affairs. Okay, well, let's put a tail on Henderson because, for one thing, they realize the guy's driving an $80,000 Mercedes and he makes $55,000 a year as a police officer. First day. The IA guys follow him to 3 bookie joints, illegal bookie joints.
Right.
Report comes back up to the chief saying, he went to 3 bookie joints. You'd think that would lead to an expanded investigation. And under Gates, whatever else you want to say about him, it would have. I mean, he may have covered up people, and he did, in fact, sometimes cover up people being abusive to people with dark complexions. There's no question about that. But he would not have done what Parks did, which send an order down saying, cease the surveillance, stop the investigation.
Well, see, I wouldn't know, not being inside the LAPD, but the shows we've done in the past and with all the different organizations that we've had on over the years, it would suggest that, Detective Poole, feel free to comment on this because you were a member of LAPD for a very long time. there seems to be that for for decades, there's always been some sort of corruptive force or forces within LAPD. And so when I hear this story, I'm like, wow, I'm not surprised.
You know what it is? What it is, Davey, is there were the abuses of authority that happened. I mean, it did break along racial lines. There were abuses of authority that happened under white administrations, which, like I said, generally had to do with brutality.
Right.
But under the first black administrations, I think that they cured that problem. But or at least they tried to. I mean, actually, I don't think they did cure that problem, but they certainly made it clear that they're going to be less tolerant of it. But they opened the door on even worse abuses. And, it's like a pendulum swinging in order to correct, the fact that it was way too far this way. They didn't stop it at midpoint or even try to. They let it go too far the other way.
I think the assumption would be that if you have all black officers, that somehow the corruption would end. But, some of the biggest problems that people have had, at least if you listen to a lot of songs, sometimes the black cops are worse than white cops.
And I think what Parks did initially, I don't think he had some sinister conspiracy in mind. Mm-hmm. He made some decisions that were an attempt to protect the reputations of other black officers because that was very important to him.
Right.
And he backed himself in a corner.
Also LAPD though. That would be a major embarrassment.
That's true. He was protecting the institution too, and you'll never know how much the racial part of it had played in it with him.
Well, that's what it all comes down to. You got to remember this was an unusual case. You had one cop killing another cop, okay? And one happened to be white and the other happened to be black. And that right there is very unusual, and I don't think it's ever happened in the history of LAPD, this type of incident. So it was a very unusual occurrence and a very intriguing case to investigate. Mm-hmm. However, that's what it comes down to. Chief Parks, if he was to investigate Gaines fully, Mack fully, Perez fully, it would expose the fact when he was in charge of internal affairs, all three of these individuals were involved in incidents that would have exposed the fact that we had several officers connected to Death Row Records who had been, at the time these incidents were happening, the FBI was investigating Death Row for racketeering and drug trafficking. And it turns out that Rafael Perez was a major dope dealer.
Now, Rafael Perez was the main witness in the Rampart scandal.
Oh, witness. He was the main suspect. He was a major dope dealer, dealing dope on duty, off duty. And, there's suspicions he was involved in some of these other incidents that we've already talked about. Mm-hmm. However, him and Mack used to be partners together, and they were involved in some officer-involved shootings together. And, there's a long list, and it was covered in the book. I mean, this book is just amazing to me. He covered so many areas, and nobody's really been able to do it.
Well, that's why it's called Labyrinth. I mean, and I hope people are following all the names and things, because we're kind of jumping into it. And for people that are just tuning in, it's 94.1 Hard Knock Radio. The voice on the phone is former LAPD detective Russell Poole. We also have Rolling Stone editor and author of the book, Randall Sullivan. And for people who are going, what's all these names? We're talking about a book. What is it, about 400 pages? It's pretty lengthy book.
300 plus.
300 plus. Okay, we'll give or take a few, but it's it chronicles a whole lot of different things, which leads to the title. Right. You're talking about the Rampart police scandal and some of the origins of that, possible origins of that. You're talking about possible people who were behind the murders of popular rap stars Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. And you're talking about the very complex situation surrounding Death Row Records, which is headed by Suge Knight, and in the complexities in the music industry. Let me just kind of jump ship a little bit, and we'll come back to the police part. You talk a lot about Death Row, and one of the things I got from the book, which you guys seem to be surprised about, was the fact that in its employment were officers, LAPD officers working for Death Row. Why was that so unusual, and why were you so surprised
about that? The department had an
that?
Official policy that officers could not work for Death Row Records. The one officer they ever acknowledged knowing worked for Death Row Records. He was the only one who actually got a permit, so he was really the only one who was slightly honest. They that resulted in a huge investigation. They made him promise that he would never work for Death Row Records again. Then they found out he was in Vegas with Tupac at the time of Tupac's death. So, but what it is that
why weren't they allowed to work for Death Row Records?
Because Death Row Records was considered to be a criminal organization. I mean, Suge Knight, as you know, has a long criminal record, and a lot of the people connected most directly with Suge Knight have long criminal records and of major criminal violence.
Suge's entourage was constructed of the Blood gang members in Los Angeles. Suge Knight was a very powerful individual, and what made him powerful, he had access to just about the entire Blood gang, and he also had dozens of police officers in his back pocket. He also had a district attorney in his back pocket who was actually handling one of his probation cases. He also he had connections with the Compton mayor, and I have a picture of Suge Knight and Mayor Reardon embracing each other. So he had access also to Maxine Waters, and there's a lot of she's a councilwoman in Los Angeles, and she actually stopped a narcotic federal probe in Texas involving her husband's best friend, and actually stopped midway through the investigation.
Right, but I'm trying to keep it connected to Suge and the Death Row situation. One of the things what I said when I started the question was that it seemed like in the book you guys were surprised. And the reason why I'm saying that is because being in the music industry, it was pretty common knowledge that police officers worked not just for Death Row, but they worked for a number of artists and institutions and labels, and are often contracted.
Well, it's not illegal to moonlight and work security for a record company. It was only illegal to work for this particular record company.
The reason why I seemed like I was going, why it's so surprised, because it was kind of chronicled in articles. There's been a few articles where people have gone like, I went to Death Row, and there were police officers there. Vibe is probably the most...
Right. Hey, the hip-hop press produced a lot of this material, no question about it. And an author named Ronan Rowe compiled a lot of it in his book, Have Gun Will Travel.
But I mean, when this happened, though, did those raise...
But those cops that they were talking about then, supposedly they were from Inglewood, Compton. They were from these other police departments that... Well, Compton was a totally corrupt police department, but still, even they eventually instituted some controls on Death Row. But they didn't have a formal policy saying you cannot work for Death Row Records, and if you do, you'll be fired.
So it was just a situation about LAPD couldn't work for there.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, Detective Poole, what was so, other than the fact that you had LAPD officers working for Death Row, how did this connect itself to maybe the Rampart scandal and the possibilities of Death Row being involved with the killings of Notorious B.I.G.? Did these police officers have any sort of connection? Did they turn a blind eye? Did they have the information? What's the story on that?
Well, over the years since 1995, there's been a series of violent acts that had occurred, and at every turn during the investigation, it was found that officers, not only from LAPD but other agencies, were actually witnesses to these occurrences, and however did not remain at the scene to give their testimony to the case
or intervene.
If they did, they would be fired. And like Randall said earlier, it was a criminal organization. It'd be like officers working for the Gambino family, moonlighting for the Gambino family. That's exactly what was going on. Death Row Records was trafficking narcotics, and there were dozens of Blood gang members who were on parole and who were working alongside these police officers while providing security. So, it was a major conflict of interest and a major officer safety problem. If you can imagine, by day you're working LAPD, busting Blood gang members, and at night you're working alongside them.
Let me ask you this. Again, and I'm not trying to paint a clean picture over this, what you describe, with say somebody like a Suge, having access and all these other things, it doesn't seem that unusual. Again, in the sense that, I mean,
there's never been a record company president who was, or CEO who was remotely as thuggish as Suge Knight or as violent as Suge Knight did things. I mean, he wasn't.
Well, now I don't. You cover Rolling Stone, right?
I'm not saying that there were a bunch of other executives at large corporations that funded Death Row that knew what they were doing and tacitly supported it. I'm not saying that's not true, and those executives were white.
The history of the music business. I mean,
business is
it's always been a thug type, and we often in the music business, although at this point in time, some of the old heads that are there now, it's very hard to draw those direct connections.
But, in those days, Davey, it was mob money. I mean, sure, the mobs were funneling money in, but they didn't have they didn't
disappear.
They didn't just actually have a mobster running the company. They would at least have a beard of some sort. I mean, Suge Knight was the president of the company, and he was the #1 thug.
Well, I think that would be. Again, if you have a good conversation, in a conversation like on radio, to sit there and go, well, is Tommy Mottola connected to the mob? Tommy that heads Sony, and we can infer things and we can get back, and I couldn't say it on the air and avoid being sued by libel, but everybody in the business, hold on a second, everybody in the business knows. Just like you're not going to roll up on Suge, you're not going to roll up on the Tommy Mottolas and anybody else. And it's always kind of been understood in the business on certain levels that cats who run these labels, they definitely have access, so to speak. They can come at you either way, either legally, they can talk to their politicians, local police department, et cetera, and handle you that way. Or if you get too far out of hand, they can have it done on the other thing. I think with the situation with Suge, it's just a lot more visible. Maybe he's not as good as camouflaging it.
Puffy's just as visible as Suge, and Puffy wasn't. Puffy Puffy might be of a piece with Tommy Mottola or any of these guys, but Suge is of a different order.
Okay.
I think Suge's a much more sinister and dangerous person than Puffy is, or Tommy Mottola.
Well, I think one smiles and one frowns.
Well, hey.
Well, but Suge was hands-on. He'd get somebody in a room, urinate into a champagne flute and say, either tell me what I want or drink this. The other guys, if they wanted that done, they had somebody else do it.
Yeah, but again, that is one of the reasons we say the music business next to politics is probably one of America's most dirty businesses, meaning that a lot of gangsterism, and crime and all this other stuff goes on behind the scenes, and it doesn't often come to light. But I mean, you 20 years in the business,
okay. Well, let me tell you this. Think of it though. Think of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin had gotten whacked by the Italian mob in 1957.
Okay.
You really think that their murders would have been swept under the carpet the way Tupac's and Biggie's have? You think 5 years would have gone by? These guys are shot on public roads in the presence of dozens of witnesses, and we still can't make an arrest. I don't think that would have happened in an alternative case.
If the police are involved.
If the police are involved, and I do think...
Then it might be... swept under. But let me ask you this, because we could talk about the music business all day on this. Detective Poole, why do you think the murders of Tupac Shakur in Las Vegas and Notorious B.I.G. in L.A. was swept under the rug? And as I ask you that question, also, are you working with Notorious B.I.G.'s mother to maybe try and facilitate the lawsuit that she's just brought up against LAPD, or to at least get to the bottom line as to who is really responsible that you can hold accountable for his killings?
Well, being the former lead investigator, I was the only one that maintained contact with Mrs. Wallace, giving her updates on how the investigation was going. When I was taken off the case, I kept it alive by always trying to keep it. I was actually trying to get the leadership, and that includes Chief Parks, to look at these clues. The case had not been solved, and there was a series of clues that pointed in the direction of at least one or two police officers involved in our department. Mm-hmm. And so, as far as helping Mrs. Wallace, I'm certain that I'm going to be subpoenaed in her lawsuit. There's no question about it. The woman deserves a full probe of the death of her son, and it hasn't been done yet. It's been ignored. A lot of this information has been out for quite a while now, and they still haven't gone out and re-interviewed these witnesses and interviewed some witnesses that haven't been talked to yet. There doesn't seem to be any interest in doing that. As far as the Tupac Shakur, I'm sure, David, you've done your homework on that. Tupac Shakur was becoming a very outstanding actor, and it came to Suge Knight's attention that Tupac was going to leave Death Row Records, and you just don't. The evidence shows you just don't leave Death Row Records and get away with it.
Now, Suge emphatically insists that he wasn't.
Well, you know what? You can listen to Suge all day, and that's been the problem. Suge Knight has had like a key to the city. He and others in the Death Row organization have been listed as suspects in several violent crimes, and then amazingly enough, the case does not get filed. And I go back to the fact that there was a district attorney that he worked with privately. This district attorney rented his Malibu home to Suge Knight and David Kenner. And so,
anyway, there's no question Tupac was going to leave Death Row. I just want to make that clear. I mean, if you have any question about it, call Charles Ogletree, who's probably the leading black attorney in the United States, and he'll tell you he was hired to do was get Tupac away from Death Row Records alive. That was essentially his job.
And Tupac knew if he was going to be killed, he knew it was going to be somebody from the Death Row organization. And when you really probe into that incident that night, it all started with the fight. The Tyson fight, and then this incident at the casino involving this Compton Crip named Orlando Anderson.
Right.
And the information I received was that incident was staged to provide a motive that would make the Compton Crips the number one suspect in the murder of Tupac Shakur. You got to remember, after that incident, Suge's entourage leaves. They go to Suge's house for an hour or two, and then they plan this a trip to Suge Knight's nightclub in Las Vegas. And at the last moment, security measures were changed. And I got this information from security guards that were working for Suge Knight. And many of those security officers were police officers. And it all comes down to what good are these armed police officers anyway, because none of them chased the guy. None of them fired their weapons. If they did, they'd be fired from their job. So, all in all, when you look at this case, there was Suge knew he could make a lot of money with Tupac out of the picture. If he leaves, there's going to be problems financially for Death Row.
Yeah, this isn't just Russell Poole's theory, by the way. I mean, both of Tupac's main bodyguards, Kevin Hackey and Frank Alexander, have told the police that Suge set Tupac up to die. Right. Snoop Dogg has told the police that Suge had Tupac killed.
But
and I don't
Suge hasn't been charged. Suge hasn't been convicted.
I don't think there's not enough evidence yet to do it.
And in all fairness, there are people that are also connected with the camp, that say otherwise. Have publicly said otherwise, et cetera, et cetera. But, that's this.
Suge has publicly said he got hit by bullets fired at Tupac's car, and we know for a fact he was not. So, he's the fact that he lied about that is a matter of absolute fact.
Yeah, but these things were printed in the paper.
But
no, he said it on national television.
Yeah, I know, but these were also printed in the paper, that this happened. So
I interviewed the Las Vegas detectives, and I heard Suge Knight's interviews. He didn't get interviewed until about 5 days after he ran. He didn't stay and give his statement originally. Then he comes back 5 days later with a statement.
Hello? And, for people that just tuned in, we had a technical glitch for a minute, but we got it straightened out, and we have Russell Poole back on the line. And, Russell, if you could continue your point.
You got to remember, after the O.J. Simpson case and what a circus atmosphere that became. The Las Vegas politicians didn't want the same occurrence in Las Vegas. And basically, the information I received from investigators, no matter what was going to happen, they weren't going to have a big trial in regards to this.
Okay.
Okay? I mean, that's just a fact of life. And then Suge Knight is good friends with the mayor, Oscar Goodman, I believe his name is.
Yeah.
And so...
Let me ask you this. We keep going back to, Suge's political connections and what have you. That is not unusual. Or tell me, is it unusual? If I have $1 million or multi-million-dollar, hundreds of $1,000,000 a year business, that's going to give me access. I mean, come on.
Well, you know what? I can really care less about that. The more power to him.
Right.
What I cared about is we had our own police officers on our force connected to his company who employed gang members who were killing people every day in South Central Los Angeles. I mean, I've got a list right here of unsolved murders in South Central in a 10-year period. It's over 1,500. And so, this type of feud between East Coast, West Coast actually feuded a war in the Los Angeles and Compton area. And, during the course of time when Suge Knight was coming up and he was starting the company, we had a series of murders that involved up-and-coming rappers. And at the time, the information we were receiving was if you didn't come to death row, you weren't going to be in business. And so Suge had a lot of power. All he had to do is hire the right people. And, in any chain of command, all you got to do is give a wink and a nod, and somebody else would take care of it for him. That's how powerful he was. And so I could really care less on how Suge made his money. My job was to try to solve the Biggie Smalls case and make the connections, put the dots together.
Now,
it involved police officers on our department, and the citizens don't want our police officers associating with gangsters off duty.
Now, let me ask you this. Will all this come out if you're subpoenaed to go to trial?
Oh, I hope so. I mean, I've been, I've gone to every law enforcement agency I can, and they're all afraid to probe this incident.
Not because of Suge.
Yes.
Law enforcement is afraid of Suge that much?
Oh, not so much now, but, man, he was a powerful figure. He was, like we were talking about, he's well-connected. And he was like hands off, and that's part of the motive on why this thing hasn't been fully investigated.
But now in Los Angeles, there's quite a few people other than Suge who are hands off.
But I've never seen. I got to tell you, I mean, whether it's deserved or not, we can argue that point. But I've never seen anybody inspire fear like Suge does. When the Rolling Stone piece came out, had virtually every movie company in L.A. make contact, want to do some kind of a movie, and every time the big obstacle was Suge Knight. And I remember I was talking to Nick Cassavetes, who's a big screenwriter in L.A., and I said, well, what is it? Is it the racial politics of it, or are they afraid of Suge? And he said, they're afraid of Suge, man. They're all afraid.
What about you guys? How come you, Randall, I mean, you didn't come in here with an entourage?
No, because I don't think that I'm what...
I mean, Suge comes to the Bay Area
I don't... Yeah, I know he does. I don't think that I'd be Suge's target. There's no record of him going after a white journalist. Or, I mean, the fact is, all of his victims are black. So that alone, I figure, gives me some amount of...
I mean, Vanilla Ice,
Well,
I mean, supposedly
Vanilla Ice,
got
Vanilla Ice was roughed up at most. I mean, he wasn't, Suge didn't hurt him, really. And,
right.
And I think that may have been a little exaggerated.
So if you was a black journalist, you think you would?
I would. I'd be more afraid if I was black, to be quite honest, because there's no doubt that, I mean, so far, the people Suge's gone after have been black because they're, for some reason, he thinks they're easier to get to, and maybe they are because they're mixing more socially. But and there's that, and I mean, Suge is many things, but not stupid, and I think he's well aware that if any harm came to somebody who's been a contributing editor at Rolling Stone for 20 years, he'd have the international media corps breathing down his neck in no time, and they'd be a lot worse than the FBI.
Suge's number one bodyguard was murdered 2 weeks ago.
Right, we were just talking about that off air.
And so,
are you?
And the story continues, and it's going to continue. I mean, that right there is an intriguing investigation.
Are you concerned because if this does involve fellow police officers, which you say, and if these charges and these allegations and all the things that you raise in the book hold to the facts, I mean, if I was sitting here, I'd be like, look, there's a lot to be lost here. So what's keeping Russell Poole, moving and shaking at a time when you could pull down an entire house of cards and really just, do a whole lot of discrediting for, the country's number one police force?
Well, you know what? I lost something big. I lost a job that I loved very much. And during the course of all these investigations and them trying to block the investigations from moving forward, certainly caused a great deal of stress in my life, and that includes my family. And I had to take in consideration my family because of it. They were living with me going through the stress of trying to solve this case. The Christopher Wallace is not here to testify, so it is my job to go out and find the witnesses and put the puzzle together for the family members of Christopher Wallace. And never in my career was I ever told to stop an investigation or stop from probing into a case. And I had to find out for myself on why. And you have to really check out the information. Randall says it all just about in this book.
Right, and the book's name is Labyrinth.
Yes.
Just for people who are interested. Let me ask you this, because we're getting ready to wrap up in a few minutes. I did a show maybe about 4 years ago, and it was a really interesting show because we were talking about gangs. And one of the things about this show was we were talking about gangs that existed within the Sheriff's Department and Police Department. We had people that worked and been a part of it that were talking about LAPD used to square off with the sheriffs, and you had little gangs like the Cavemen, and people had pictures and gang signs. And I mean, I even saw something on the Discovery Channel with the Crash Unit where they had their little rituals. Was it that unusual for black officers who you said were affiliated with the Bloods? Would that be unusual in the backdrop of, having the charges levied that there were gangs or people who took on gang-like behavior in the L.A. Police and Sheriff Department? Well,
you got to understand, it's just a small percentage. Most of the black officers would not want to work alongside these officers who were working off duty for death row.
Right.
I can guarantee that. Okay, the number one priority for a police department is the safety and the security of its police department. If you've got a organization like Death Row selling drugs and being investigated by the FBI for racketeering, it's just definitely a conflict of interest. These officers.
No, I'm not disputing that, Detective Poole. I mean, I'm 100% agree with you. I think that's despicable behavior. But what I'm saying is that before Death Row, was at its heyday, you still had the situation where you could point to and say, well, here's these guys that are exuding some sort of gang-like behavior, whether they were the Cavemen. I wish I should have brought the magazine and the book.
Now that stuff was 30s and 40s.
No, this was 1990s. I remember we had the show.
That behavior would not be tolerated under certain management. Okay, it wasn't. See, Willie Williams, I knew Willie Williams, and Willie Williams was a nice man, and he was not a corrupt police chief. He never had a chance from the get-go, being an outsider from the East Coast coming in, and he assigned Chief Parks as assistant chief in the beginning. And what Chief Williams found out is Parks was trying to undermine his leadership, and what resulted was Chief Williams demoting Chief Parks in 1994 from assistant chief back down to deputy chief.
Right.
That created a major animosity, and eventually Parks was in charge of internal affairs. And a lot of this stuff was designed to make Chief Williams look bad, and if anybody is lucky enough to interview Chief Williams, he'll tell you he settled
Right. I'm not disputing that, and I think people should read the book to really get to the meat of that. But I'm talking about just in general terms. I mean, let's talk about.
Well, it's up.
Hold on a second. Let me ask you about, say, Chief Gates.
Okay.
For example, with the allegations and things that you described, has he been an outspoken, person on this issue to say, look, how dare these officers, or these people in leadership position take down a force that he has been responsible for resurrecting and bringing to the public's light for good and for bad?
Well,
I mean, somebody like him, how does he respond to those sorts of things that have been described in the book?
Well, I'll tell you what, if Chief Gates found out that we had officers associated with death row records and we had officers dealing dope, heads would have rolled, okay? That is completely different from excessive force cases. That's what, a lot of the public, we saw in the Rodney King thing. But in the process of this one incident, this Rodney King incident, it brought down an entire police department when it shouldn't have. Chief Gates, all in all, got a raw deal. He was a dedicated police chief, okay? And he was very popular with all the police officers of all races, okay?
Now, when we did that show...
He had his faults, but I'll tell you what, he had a strong internal affairs, and one thing he wouldn't have tolerated was any criminal behavior, okay?
Now, when we did that show on the gangs and the tension and actual that escalated to fights more often than not between LAPD and the sheriffs, this came out of his tenure. These weren't newly formed.
I don't know what you're talking about. I know we have the police Olympics where we.
No, these were actual gangs.
You know what? I'm telling you, Chief Gates would have never tolerated any type of gang, organized gang within the LAPD. If he would have found out about that, heads would have rolled. Okay, in my 19 years, I never heard of an organized gang involving police officers, okay? I never did, except these police officers that associated themselves with the death row records and the blood gangs.
Okay.
And Chief Parks knew about this since 1995. And nothing was done about it.
Well, the name of the book is Labyrinth, and you can get all these things, and it's going to raise a lot of questions, and we'll be having discussions like this, Hey,
Davey, you really are keeping it going, I got to tell you.
So let me, because we got to close out, let me give you guys an opportunity to get your last thoughts to our audience, anything that you would like to convey to them. I'll start off with you, Detective Poole, and good luck with the case, and I'm glad to see that you're helping Violetta Wallace's, I was going to say Violetta Wallace's, Biggie's moms. So any last comments from you?
Yes, I just hope that the truth comes out and I get a chance to testify and present the evidence that I have, and her attorneys get a chance to present the evidence that they have, that the case was not properly investigated, and reason being is police officers were involved, and there was a cover-up.
Well, I hope to God that comes out and we can bring everybody to justice. And Randall, last comments from you?
Well, I think that Ms. Wallace's lawsuit is going to be the force in the forum that brings whatever there is to bring to light.
And they're not going to get to her and make her settle out of court.
She inherited a lot of money from her son. She doesn't need what they have to offer. And this is a formidable woman of considerable character. I don't think they're going to buy her off.
And they won't buy you off either. None of you guys.
Well, it's too late for that.
Just
with
trying
me.
to get it on the record.
But she's tolling the lawsuit.
Hold on a second. Go ahead, Paul.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Detective.
Yeah, I haven't taken a penny for anything, and I lost a job where I was making between $80,000 and $90,000, and I'm struggling now. But more importantly is the truth, and I'm still plugging away. I'm still available to testify. I'm not afraid to testify. I've never been afraid of Suge Knight. But the only way to get to Suge Knight would be from the bottom up, and that's through these police. The key to Sullivan is through the police officers that were working in the organization. Because once one rolled, then they all start rolling.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And let me get your last comments, Randall.
Well, I was just going to say that, the lawsuit, they say in the lawsuit that it was inspired by the Rolling Stone article, but the Rolling Stone article was inspired by the investigation of Russell Poole. And I really think that what he and Biggie's mom are going to accomplish together, the all-time odd couple, is really what's going to, I think they're going to be vindicated and validated, and a lot of what we're saying is going to be proven true in that lawsuit.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you guys for rolling through, and the book is Labyrinth. You might want to pick up a copy and peep it, and you'll have these invigorating discussions. And we're going to continue to talk about, whether or not the music business is mob controlled after we get off air, because that was a funny, that was a very funny remark there, Randall. But